Proud. I love this. You're so ready. Are we ready? Are we? I'm going to shuffle just around this way so I can see you all. Just in terms of health and safety, you can get out to the loos either through that door or the one at the back. The fire exits are where you came in and out this way. This is like my air hostess training. The other, we do have first aiders in the room. So if you are struggling for whatever reason and need a hand, you can head out to this corner and out that door, or again, make yourself known heading out the back. And then just in terms of general rules of discussion, we are here tonight to have a discussion. We've got our panelists. This is also an opportunity to hear from you and to ask questions. We do have a safer spaces policy that boils down to be kind and be conscious of who else is in the room. And if we find, or if I find, basically, that someone is being needlessly cruel or petty or disrespectful, then the mic will be swiftly removed. I think that's the main housekeeping. We're going to have a wee bit of discussion, and then I'm going to bring the mic out to you, and then we're also going to hear from some people who are doing some organising, who are going to tell us a little bit about what they're going to do. I'm going to start with just a brief reading for anyone who doesn't know who Resisting Transphobia in Edinburgh is, who are the real organisers for this, and Lighthouse was merely facilitating. So Resisting Transphobia in Edinburgh is a grassroots umbrella group containing people from many organisations and none, taking action through different member-instigated projects that include education, protests, art, and more to bring about societal change and to show solidarity and support to other marginalised groups. I'd encourage everyone here to find the soul, join us, find a way of getting stuck in. And now I'm just going to run through quickly some bios for our panel, and then I'm going to go through the questions that we have already introduced you. So first up, we have Leslie on the end. He is a trans man based in Edinburgh, a member of Unite Scotland's LGBT community, and a national organiser for RS21, which is Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century. RS21 recently published the pamphlet Fighting Transphobia, which you can find on Pete's stall at the back. Next up, we have Nat. Nat is a poet and activist scholar involved in queer and trans activism for over a decade. Nat organised with Edinburgh Action for Trans Health, Mutual Aid Trans Edinburgh, and Queer Resistant. She is the author of 4 books of poetry. And then we've got Tilly. She is an illustrator, musician, and local trans woman about town. She is an active organizer with the International Workers of the World in the bar industry. Tilly is passionate about the power of intersectional organizing and overcoming barriers to unionizing. You can read some of her work through the links on the website. And finally, the wonderful Gina. She is an interdisciplinary researcher, tutor, and lecturer in trans studies, queer studies, and English literature at the University of Edinburgh. As well as being an academic and manager of SWIS, she lectures and publishes on trans issues relating to trans cultural production, media studies, and digital humanities. Will you all join me in putting your hands together for tonight's panel? So just to keep it nice and simple to start off, we've got the big old question, what is trans liberation? What's the difference between trans rights and trans liberation? And I think maybe just to sort of set things up there, if you can talk each a little bit about what trans liberation means to you personally and what you think trans liberation means in terms of the bigger politics. Shall we? I'm going to kick it to the end and then we can work our way down. So Leslie first.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much indeed to Lighthouse Books for so kindly hosting this event. Well, what does trans liberation mean to me personally? I suppose it just means the right to be myself. And I think the thing is that while we all recognise it's very important to defend and fight for trans rights, thinking obviously of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill Scotland, which the Tories nuked at the beginning of this year. I mean, obviously it's important to try and campaign for these sort of rights, but rights are something that can be taken away as well as given. So for me, it's very important to look beyond the rights thing and think about what real liberation means. And I think it's basically addressing issues that don't just affect trans and non-binary people, but when we look at the patriarchy that we have and the capitalist system that we have now, women are oppressed. We want to deal with that. We want to smash patriarchy. We want to have real liberation for women. And we also want to stop the fact that children at the moment are regarded as the property of the family and ultimately of the state. Children have rights. Trans kids have rights, but trans kids, like all of us, need liberation.
I'm going to try and jump into what Leslie's just put into the room. For me, I think liberation is about, I've been echoing some words from my collaborator, Mika van der Drift, with co-writing a book. And Mika's always like, it's about total liberation for everyone, right? Which is from Robin Kelly, who's a really great Black studies scholar. Total liberation for everyone. So we're also talking about, it's already about an intersectional form of liberation, because it's about oppression from gendered forms of violence, like generally, in a broader sense. It's about liberation from forms of structural violence. It's about liberation from the state. It's also about, thinking through how trans liberation is already rooted in histories of disability justice. It's rooted in anti-colonial histories, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but not in this point. And really also thinking about, also, just for a minute, there's a genocide going on in Gaza, right? The Palestinian liberation is about trans liberation. Trans liberation should be about Palestinian liberation. This is about liberation from forms of colonial oppression and violence that are ongoing throughout the world. And what do I want to say? In terms of rights, I think we really have to have a think about what I am quite frustrated about a general consensus of or a general thing I see, which is we all want trans rights, sure. But there's something about what we're actually asking for and thinking through the implications of that. Sure, legal gender recognition is great. There's a question of how far that's going to take us, right? So it's really not necessarily going to liberate us from the state, if the state is a form of violence, if the state is racist, if the state is capitalist, colonialist, neoliberal, incarcerating people, Trans liberation is about all of those things as well. It's also, trans liberation is abolitionist in this sense. So I'm not convinced that the state are gonna liberate us. And if we're gonna wait around for the state to do that, it's only gonna liberate the most privileged of us. It's only gonna make sure that white middle class people end up comfortable at the end of this. And we've seen that with what's happened with gay marriage, And that's not to diss gay marriage, but it is to say it's interesting to see how what has happened to our queer and trans movement politically, and in terms of where it's got us, it's got strategic uses, but yeah. So I'm a bit cautious in that question around what kind of rights are we asking for? I think there's much more to say if we're talking about healthcare, if we're talking about these things that really have, how do rights seriously, materially affect us?
I think, I think I want to really just dovetail with what Nat and Leslie have been saying. I think for me, the thing about trans rights is when we get equality with the cisgender people, what's next? The fact of the matter is can cisgender people really be said to be liberated? Can anyone really be said to be liberated when we spend most of our days doing wage labor for a dictator in the workplace, when we spend a good amount of our money paying off a landlord in our homes? Liberation for trans people, I believe, means liberation from those things, means liberation from racial injustices and from colonialism. I think as long as as long as oppression exists, we can never really be said to be liberated. And I think there is a real danger in focusing solely on an individual group's rights, because if we do that, we're missing out on the bigger picture that, like, you know, with the GRA reforms, for instance, what we've basically fought for is and what we are fighting for is the government to have a big special list of trans people. And personally, I'm not going to go for a GRC because I don't really want the government to have a big list with me on it. But the fact of the matter is it's very unlikely that, say, homeless trans people or immigrant trans people, asylum seeker trans people are going to be able to get on those lists and are going to be able to get those systemic benefits, because the way that neoliberal society works is it punishes people who do not fit in a mold in a form of society-wide eugenics. So I think to kind of circle back, I'm getting a little offbeat. Yeah, I think trans liberation for me means the liberation of all mankind, and that is simultaneously a big thing, but I think something that we can fight for in our everyday lives, and that's something that we'll get to soon, I'm sure.
Okay, it's very difficult to add anything because Tilly and Leslie and Nat have talked so well. So what I would like to say is, before this evening, it was actually quite troubling for me because I realized I didn't know what trans liberation means. I knew what trans rights meant. I've lived in a kind of political silo these past 5 or 6 years during the trans moral panic. And to be honest, the word liberation was never part of my vocabulary. It was survival. And maybe a lot of trans people out there can kind of identify with that. As it progressively has got worse, and we've seen the social attitudes survey increasingly show that larger numbers of the British public are now turning hostile against trans people. And so my politics has been based almost around George Square. It is literally, it's almost geographical. It's in Edinburgh University. It's dealing with the anti-trans activism there. It's creating pro-trans events. It's just about trying to preserve what we have, protect, react, defend. It's not anything inspiring, and the agenda has in some ways been set by anti-trans people this past 5 years, and I've been as guilty as anybody in just thinking about that. So trans liberation is this whole new thing, and I've been trying to study and do my homework for today and thinking, what does that even mean? And off the bat, I think it means asking some very difficult questions, because I'm kind of protected in a kind of silo of very pro-trans activism with allies, people who know the right vocabulary, who know my pronoun. Sorry, by the way, Gina, she, her. Sorry, there we go. So, but mass movements, solidarity movements, that means working with the larger British public, which increasingly is becoming transphobic. So there are some really difficult questions to ask about liberation and liberation movements that I'm sure we'll talk about this evening, and which socialists and people on the left are having these conversations all the time now, because I think there's a realization just talking about identity in itself, it's really important to look after and protect minorities, but in itself, it's not enough. We need something bigger than just rights, as the three other speakers have talked about so capably, and I'm sure we'll talk about that this evening. So trans liberation for me is a scary topic, which means coming out of the silo and thinking about how do we engage publicly with the really big structural questions of who do we deal with and who do we work with in a politics of solidarity.
Thank you all for such brilliant scene setting. And I think I wanted to lead on from that into this question of history, both a history of trans liberation, but a history that is both recent and goes back generations and hundreds of years of our very understanding of what it is to be free and what it is to be human, that has brought us into a room together collecting all these struggles and finding those common threads so that we can have four people who are committed to trans liberation talking about people being bombed in Gaza and about people being evicted from their homes and about all of those very deliberate cruelties of the world that we exist in. So just sort of looking back at that history and placing this moment of trans liberation in that history, whether personally or on the bigger picture. I'll bump down the line, but I'm going to start with you, Nat, to take us a little bit back through the history.
Yeah, so I guess that for me, it's always this question around like, what does liberation mean? Where does the grammar or the idea of liberation come from? And like, historically speaking, like the language of liberation, this dialogue, this discourse of liberation, this idea of what liberation involves, it comes from anti-colonial movements, it comes from anti-imperialist movements, you know, it comes from like the idea of the liberation front, you know, like the gay liberation front. The language of that is directly lifted from the Vietnamese liberation front when, you know, there was a resistance movement against the US's imperialist war in Vietnam and in the 60s. And there was a whole global movement around that, right? And that's where the grammar of liberation came from, in the sense of women's liberation, gay liberation. And it's also coming out of Black and third world liberation, so Black and brown liberation movements that are all emerging at the same time. And within all of those contexts, right, like the seeds of trans liberation are in there. Like trans liberation and gay liberations were never two separate things. You know, we're talking about Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera's work in STAR in the late 60s, early 70s, after Stonewall, or in the moment of Stonewall. And, you know, their fight, like the language, their whole understanding of what liberation means is it's against this like racist, sexist, white supremacist, homophobic, transphobic form of capitalism and of governments. So for me, like liberation is about how do we destroy those things? How do we get rid of it? How do we make sure those things no longer have power over our lives and our bodies? And so then that's like, okay, so that's like the 60s and into the 70s. So yeah, so I always think about like, we can always go back to these things in the forms of like strategies and ideas that you know, these liberation movements were saying, and there's so much in this moment of history as well, right? There's also like mental patients liberation of people who are like fighting psychiatric incarceration, including LGBT people, right, who were being routinely incarcerated in hospitals. And simultaneously, there was a movement for youth liberation by minors, you know, basically trying to liberate themselves from parents. And again, like and there's homeless liberation, all of these elements. And so, like, within that, there's a struggle around gender and like how trans people, like, we bought that grammar of like, okay, so gender is a key element of what's like of all these forms of oppression. You know, the state somehow, for some reason, continues to need gender in order for it to function. So what do I want to then say? I want to say that this is then unfolding over the last 50 years, although it's also more than that. There's like really interesting links in the 19th century as well around what's happening with colonialism and the oppression of trans people, and you know, and it all goes back to the project of the British Empire and you know the laws against homophobia and trans expression that we exported, like Britain exported across the world. I guess I'm also thinking about one of the key people who also stands out for me when thinking about histories of trans liberation is Leslie Feinberg, who I think passed away like this week, right? Like in 2016, 2015. And Leslie Feinberg was like, remembered me as a revolutionary communist, trade unionist, organizer, who was working within often very gendered, but often very queer, very trans workplaces, trying to fight again, exactly these kinds of union oppression that Tilly's talking about tonight. And so within all of this, it's like trans liberation's always been it's like always been about disability justice, it's always been about abolition, it's always been about working class liberation. And so that's, for me, that's really what the history is about. And I think like if we can't think about how we maybe are reproducing those forms of oppression in the kinds of organizing we do, that's also a real problem. And like we're all involved in this, you know, we all benefit from this capitalist nation state that we find ourselves within tonight.
Thanks, Nat. Go for it.
to add on a little bit about what Nat said at the end there, I do think that it's very easy to forget that history and even the more recent history. The one issue that we in the union have been have dealt with historically and have been dealing with, but have been making better progress on recently, is very often you see this sort of turnover, and this can be in any liberationist or anti-capitalist movement. You see this thing where people come along, they get very engaged, then some circumstance changes in their life, and they leaving all the experience that they had along with them. And I believe that it's really, really important to hold on to that knowledge and to share it down. And that's one of the reasons why I very much believe that, we need older activists and stuff. We need folks who have experience, and they have to talk about, pass that experience on. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I had another thing, but I totally forgot it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such an important point to make, just that those traditions that go down, and generation after generation, that knowledge that should get passed down. How do we make sure that we're keeping those links alive, that we're creating cross-generational networks that are inviting in that knowledge and giving it the right to be seen of as, specialists, or bringing something to the table, and not just this idea of, well, you were there back then, but there's a whole new age.
You reminded me what I was going to say.
Great.
Sorry. In the union, one thing that we do to address this is basically we kind of do these monthly meetups where we invite activists, organizers, and even activists from other unions who haven't, who have been going for a long time, and then some folks who have are relatively new to all this, with the idea that we set a theme and we just kind of have a conversation around a table around it. And even something as simple as that is actually really, really good, because every time I come away learning something, whether it's an interesting wee piece of history about Leslie's backstory, or whether it's an organizing technique I hadn't thought of. For instance, a good friend of mine has been, and they've been thinking of writing it up, has been really talking about this going along kind of method of organizing, which really involves just showing up to things and being from an organization, but also trying really hard to build social bonds, and then using those social bonds as a way to organize into revolutionary action.
I love that. Go ahead, Leslie.
Very quickly, how could I follow these excellent speakers? But just something occurred to me when Nat was talking at the end about, capitalism wanting to keep, these gendered roles and the family going. I think it's not just the case. People talk a lot, quite rightly, about the Tories picking on trans and non-binary people, using us as a political football. But I think there's actually a material reason why this is happening. I think it was in the pamphlet here, I read that capitalist class is actually really worried, and at least in countries like Britain and the US of A, about the fact that so many young people are identifying as trans, non-binary, LGBT+, or queer in some way or other. And this is obviously a massive threat from their point of view to the reproduction of labour. Because if we don't have the current kind of family setup in which basically women are doing an awful lot of unpaid work. It's not always women, but it's generally women that are doing a lot of unpaid work in the home, and also often, just doing about 4 or 5 jobs, most of it they're not getting any money for. And if they didn't have that unpaid work, if women weren't, made to be subordinate in many cases to men in the family setup, and that's not to say that all men are sexist, by the way, but the way they like it to be, it's like the man's there, the woman does what the man tells them, and the kids are out doing there, they do what the parents tell them, particularly the father, and that is very convenient, because basically they go on, they get the next generation of labour power. And if they didn't get a next generation of labour power, if people start setting up alternative ways of living, alternative family setups, chosen families if you like, getting away from this sort of capitalist family setup, which is actually quite recent. It really just goes back to about the mid-19th century, if I remember rightly. They would really be struggling. So we are actually a threat. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why they hate us, not just the fact that, they can say nasty things about us to distract from the cost of living crisis and the fact the planet's going up in flames and drowning in floods. Anyway.
Thank you, Leslie. Gina.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm kind of split in two different places with this idea of history and the contemporary. Yeah, there's loads of great history, and when you look into it, like, for example, there was an anti-trans screening of a film, an anti-trans film in Edinburgh in April and in December, and I was doing some research about other places where screenings have been, and one of the classic examples is Birth of a Nation, around 1915. Very, very racist film, which had huge resonance. It boosted the membership of the KKK, basically. It became like a recruiting tool. So this public screening was a very powerful tool for basically intimidating black and brown people in the US, and they protested. They worked. A lot of the most effective protests, it seemed, was when they got in coalition with Catholics and Jews, because the KKK hated all of them. And a lot of the more successful protests were those coalitional types. And that's, when you look at those kinds of historical examples of when there was something gratuitously offensive and racist, for example, that the mainstream media was totally supportive of, and the majority of white people, of course, were supportive of, but there were coalitions that came together to protest. You look at that kind of history and you realize, you see this sense of mutuality of we're all human beings, and these different minority groups, although I'm not for a moment comparing trans people to post-Reconstruction USA, the black community, but there are all these different liberation movements that have had to find tactics to find liberation. And it's interesting, it's always beneficial to look into the past for ideas in the present. Another really good example, the Black Panthers I think this was in the 1960s, so it was a socialist black liberation movement, and they went to the Appalachians in eastern US, a very kind of white working class area. There was a lot of racism. They worked with people from the Appalachians. It was a patriot movement. They had the Confederate flag as their symbol. That wouldn't have been easy for the Black Panthers. And again, it's about this idea of difficult conversations, difficult coalitions. But by the end, this white group that the Black Panthers were working with in terms of solidarity politics, they decided to get rid of the Confederate flag as their symbol out of respect for the Black Panthers after working with them. So you have these historical moments that we can learn a lot from and be inspired by. In terms of the contemporary, I have such a shallow, kind of embarrassing set of tastes that I just want to briefly share, because where I learned about liberation was not these examples to begin with. It was ContraPoints, which is a YouTube video essayist. Some of you might watch ContraPoints. I love ContraPoints, but I know not everybody does. But she's this, well, for me, she's this amazing trans video essayist. And I know in 2021, she said, let's adopt this new slogan of trans liberation now. And I did notice on Twitter, it started a trend. So I don't know if ContraPoints started this new wave, but it was different. So I just want to say that because it is kind of confusing, this idea that there's only one meaning of trans liberation. I got my first taste of trans liberation through ContraPoints, and it is a slightly different way. Basically for her, it was about trans politics. She was fed up of the trans women are women slogan because it turns equality battles into basically battles about validation, and the response of, well, what is a woman? Trans women are not women. That becomes the discussion rather than, for ContraPoints, equality, which is why she wanted to adopt this slogan from the 1970s, from the Gay Liberation Front and so forth, of trans liberation now. So this is something, there are new cycles of this happening in these trans counterpublics. Sean Fay, her latest book, The Transgender Issue, talks a lot about this liberation politics. So these new cycles, I mean, yeah, I'm kind of embarrassed that this is where I learned about them first, but basically what it shows is, as well, there's a dissatisfaction with some of the strategies that maybe trans people have been sucked into in terms of a kind of validation politics, although I totally understand it. And given that the anti-trans movement is all about saying horrific things about, for example, trans women or about trans masculine people as well. So yeah, I think trans people have reached a point where we need something new, not just new slogans, new concepts, new forms of coalitional politics in different ways, because the status quo hasn't really been working. And so basically trying to join up the dots. There are lots of inspiring examples in history that trans people can turn to in terms of understanding how we can broaden things. And and ContraPoint's point as well, maybe we should always be rethinking and thinking about what trans people are doing right now, what we can do better, what we can abandon, what we can, new ideas. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Can I continue on?
Go for it, yeah.
Okay. Aye. So I did quite like what you said about like coalitional organizing. Obviously, as a union organizer in the bar industry, there's going to be a lot of lads. Homophobia is one of the things that we do have to deal with when we're organizing. I read this really lovely article by an American organizer in the IWW named Colt Thundercat. The article has a swear word in the title. Is it okay if I say that? Yeah. It's Beyond Fuck You, it's called. And basically, the case that they made in this article, which I found very salient, was when you need someone on your side, there's the instinct almost when they say something homophobic, where they say something transphobic, to just say, right, fuck off, and just get rid of them. But in the long run, sometimes we actually need them on our side, especially in a workplace. And one of the things that they encouraged was this mode of organizing. It especially works better when you have other folks that will back you up. But trying to reach a connection, for instance, Colt, who the author of the article, when they were talking about this, mentioned, so they're gay and they're Jewish. So there was one worker in particular who was also Jewish, but was quite homophobic, and they kind of reached a mutual accord through, their shared ancestry, and then said, how would you like it if somebody said that about that, And I think I'm a big proponent of that that method of organizing, because I feel that the majority of folks, when they have like some anti-trans view, it'll be something they've picked up, but they've not probably talked to a trans person. And then when you actually talk to them, like the number of times as a bartender I've had somebody be transphobic to me is vastly dwarfed by the number of times some extremely drunk but well-meaning guy has been like, oh, I think everyone should just be able to live how they want to live, The Eastway Tap, like one of the pubs that I sometimes pop into, I don't actually drink in there, I only get orange juice because their drinks are too expensive. But one of the guys there, Ian, I remember once came in like wearing all these jewels and all this bling and that, and I'm talking to him, I'm like, here, Ian, why are you wearing all these jewels? He's like, oh, well, you come in here looking like an idiot all the time, so I figured I might as well too. And like, I think sometimes like doing that sort of thing, doing that sort of like reaching out to folks as if they're normal folk, when you're actually talking to them, well, you realize everyone just has a story, and everyone's their own person. And by and large, most people want to be nice. And even if they have some objectionable views, if you can find a way around that, something that you've got in common with them, like often you can actually build some kind of coalition. Like often like, like folks that you wouldn't think, oh, he's a big hard man, he's not going to be on my side. But then actually, you never know, maybe he's got like a trans daughter or something, But aye.
Brilliant.
I'm going to jump in just
go for it.
Building coalition, building the commonality. There's something I also really hate the trans women and women slogan. Like when this started like coming up as a slogan again in like 2017, 2018, I was like, uh-oh, this is going to get boring fast. And like because actually and I keep ripping off my collaborator, so it's fine, but we work together. And my collaborator is always like, no, but a much better slogan is trans misogyny is misogyny, which is like, oh yeah, because like we're all involved in fighting misogyny. Like trans misogyny is a really specific form of misogyny within a broader understanding of what misogyny is, right? And it's like, don't even get me started on the micro dealing with trans misogyny. But like we're all involved in fighting misogyny, you know, even those of us who are trans, I identify as trans femme, like we can still reproduce misogyny. You know, we're all, any individual on this planet can be misogynist at one moment and not misogynist at another. So it's like, okay, so then it becomes like we all do have this broad common struggle to fight this form of gender oppression, right? Which is what the politics of liberation is about, again, right? So, yeah, I don't know. That's my thoughts.
Go for it.
Very quickly. Just in terms of actually finding common ground with people where you might apparently not have any. I can't resist telling this story. I was actually at an exhibition opening in a rather posh art gallery in Newtown, who very bourgeois of me, haha. And I was wearing all my badges and stickers, and a gentleman came up, having had a few G&Ts, I think, and said he actually took exception to one badge that said "Refugees Welcome." He told me for about 15 minutes why he thought my badges were a barrier to communication. When I eventually got a word in edgeways, I said that, well, you know, basically, I gave him a few things about stats about refugees. He listened. I said, well, Ken, you know, the only person I really wouldn't have a conversation with is a homophobic racist who votes Tory. And he said, well, you're speaking to me. And I said, well, I don't think from our conversation you're homophobic. I don't think you're racist. He says, oh, but I'm a Tory voter. I said, well, my mother's a Tory voter, but I phone her every evening. Anyway, to cut a long story short, by the end of the night, we were best mates. So now I've got a best mate who's called Gordon, who's a Tory. And just finally, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, despite all the rubbish you see in the media, transphobic stuff, Ken, the sticker's not. I've never had a nasty look, let alone a nasty word. I'm absolutely convinced that there's only a small, unfortunately vocal minority of bampots and idiots. The vast majority of people are really nice.
Be a truth universally accepted that the wisdom of bartenders and bus drivers knows no comparison. I love a lot of what's coming up here, and just to echo and round up that idea of meeting people where they are being a really important place of beginning dialogue wherever we can, and that we're all on a journey wherever that might be. And we've all had a place where maybe the thing that got us to understand a struggle may have been something we're now embarrassed to talk about, or a singer that we were a fan of that said a throwaway comment once, or however we get there, whatever it was. If it got us in the room, if it gets you in the room, then it's a start. And that idea that if liberation struggle is trans struggle, and then trans struggle is liberation struggle, and that feedback loop that you captured so well, Nat, in that sense of history, we can draw from whatever liberation struggles, whatever victories have been won against oppression, whatever those fights were. We can claim that history and use that history as our own, because queer people will have been in the room for every one of those. So I love that we have taken ourselves through a bit of theory, a bit of history, and I want to talk a little bit now about this idea of intersectionalism, which has been a really big part of everything that you've talked about. And so the question that we'd listed on the website was, how does the project of trans liberation intersect with other struggles, such as class, abolitionism, and women's liberation? It's come up in different places, but I wonder if you could each speak to maybe one instance where you've really seen those two things meet and feed on each other in a positive way. So I'm going to bounce to Eugenia first.
Okay, you're not going to like my answer though, because so I've been thinking about, well, the other three will say something really good about solidarity and class and so forth. So, but I have been thinking a lot just recently about how do we connect with, so for example, the lower working class, the white van man of the Essex man voter that is stereotyped in voting, who voted Brexit, who is perhaps on Twitter tweeting things about refugees. So yeah, I was listening to Dan Evans, this academic, talking about this situation, that this petty bourgeoisie, as he calls it, that he's also a part of, from South Wales, that these lower middle class people who are tradesmen and so forth, who hold potentially objectionable views on certain issues, but Dan Evans believes that there's the possibility of solidarity because they also have potentially radical positions on, well, indeed even many conservatives today have potentially radical leftist positions on things like nationalizing electricity and energy, water, greater funding for the NHS and so on. So in terms of class solidarity, it's potentially there. The question is, how do we do it? Am I involved at the moment in identity politics or something larger? It's something that I have to ask myself, and I've been asking myself even just prior to this. How much am I doing to kind of cross those rivers, cross the bridges towards people who might ordinarily frighten me? So there are potential class solidarities in Britain right now, but there's also a lot of stereotypes in my head of the Brexit voter, for example, or of which there are many, right? 52%, or at least there was the last count. So yeah, I'm just kind of babbling slightly, but basically my point is that there should be class solidarity. It has to be a mass movement, like liberation has to be a mass movement. And so it starts with class, it starts with, the working class and lower middle class and middle class, downwardly mobile middle class, which I think is my category. There are many, many people, millions and millions of people, but we have to have like a language, a discourse, or a methodology, a way of bringing together that class solidarity so that it works. And that's the big question, because I have been in situations where I've been confronted by, transphobic abuse or just subtle or otherwise. I work in a place which has anti-trans campaigners, and there are limits to your solidarity. There are people who are obsessively hateful of trans people, which I probably would not want to engage with. So it's about knowing what are the boundaries within this class-based mass movement that we need to build. So in terms of the word class, I see the word class and I think, yes, and that's a very complex thing, right? Like, there are people today who are working at university who are earning £7,000 a year, and there are people who are working class who have asset wealth, they own a house and so on, and they're actually doing quite well. So class is quite complex, but generally what brings us all together is a real dissatisfaction and a despair, the way that Britain is at the moment. Thatcherism has failed in terms of its ideas, neoliberalism has failed. We want something more radical. It's about having class solidarity, and I'm still working it in my head, and I think people on the left are still beginning to have this conversation now, and it's not an easy one, because if you're from a minority, how much are you prepared to give, even within that class situation? So I don't have any easy answers to that, but I think it's the kind of thing that we need to talk about in these kinds of spaces.
Actually, if I could bounce it to Leslie, just because I think you have been a walking, talking example of exactly where we see flags flown side by side and on picket lines, and in those spaces where those different worlds meet and people get to realize actually it's the same world, we're all embedded. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thanks very much. Well, that's really kind. I mean, I think other folk here have probably done far more than me. But I mean, you might have noticed I've been wandering about with an RMT hat. I'm not actually a member of the RMT, but it was rather nice. My husband Graham and I and many other folk had been going along to the RMT picket lines. I think the first strikes were in the summer of last year. And, we'd take our Unite Pride flags along, and nobody ever said anything nasty about them. In fact, I got the impression they thought they were quite colourful. So they kind of got used to us. And I think there was one day in particular, it was really freezing cold, and we've been handing out the RMT stickers and leaflets to the public, who were extremely supportive of the strikes, by the way. And we were all just finishing up, and Graham and I were leaving, and one of the reps, the RMT reps, came down the street after us and gave us each an RMT hat, which are brilliant, by the way. They're not as colourful as UCU hats, but they keep your ears warm. And so I think that's the thing. I mean, if you're consistent, if you do turn up, if it's not just like parachuting in, you know, whatever, and you know, try to sell your newspapers or whatever, then never seen again, maybe that's no so good. But if you go along, and I mean, I think the thing is that, on the one hand, you don't want to be dishonest about where you're coming from politically, but at the same time, not kind of shoving the politics down people's throats. If folk are in a picket line, they've got important things. They're on strike, for goodness sake. That's the main thing. Always bring cakes. That's the important thing. Solidarity and cakes. But, you know, I think eventually, even if people are maybe not entirely sure initially, when they actually realise, as has been pointed out, that you're actually just a human being, a working class person like themselves, you can overcome a lot of barriers. And the other thing that occurs to me is, I think for once, Cruella Braverman and Trashy Sunak did us a favour. I think it was one day at the Tory conference, Cruella Braverman comes out with a disgusting attack on refugees, yet again, surprise, surprise, being LGBT+, or even I think said being a woman, and you know, a woman is suffering from misogyny and sexism. Is it enough to allow you to apply for refugee status? Oh no. And then I think it was the next day, Trashy Sunak starts having a go at trans people. I mean, they really joined up the dots, didn't they? How convenient. I mean, they really made the connection. I mean, we'd been making it for a long time, but then they made it for us. Thank you, Tories. I mean it most insincerely.
I'm going to jump in because I was going to talk about the hostile environment. So you'd like beautifully set it up, Leslie. Yeah, and I think there's this question around like, where do our struggles meet as well, right? Does everyone know what the hostile environment is, right? Nods, some nods. Anyone not know? Because if there's people, anyone? Yeah, okay, good. Just in the sense of like, so with the hostile environment policy in the UK, which has, you know, led to all of these like relentless document checks that are designed to, you know, make Britain a hostile place for migrants and refugees and for people of color broadly, especially black folks. There's this question of like, okay, so in the forms of bureaucracy that have been instituted through the hostile environment policy, which is like, okay, so if you go and work in any public institution, you're going to have your passport checked, right? And this can be quite, it's not just work, it's also like if you're trying to get housing in some parts of the UK, because obviously Scotland is part of the UK still, like you might face that around trying to access healthcare. These are all really concrete material, like concrete things that affect our everyday lives. And obviously also we as trans people, you know, okay, so the whole question about GRA is also GRA reform is trying to make our lives a little bit easier around documents. But surely the actual problem is having to show your papers all of the effing time, right? And it then becomes like, okay, so sure, as trans people, we have particular, like as trans and non-binary folks, like there are particular things that are upsetting for us around that. Like it might be your identity marker in your document, your gender marker, might be to do with the name, might be to do with your picture. And then you're like, oh great, this place that I work at's got this terrible picture of me on file. Like, or I've got it on file because I've got to send it to them via email every time they want to see my passport or whatever. But then in practice, it's like, okay, so the burden of proof that's put on the people the hostile environment is targeting, is intense. And like, this is really extreme around LGBTQ asylum seekers and refugees. Some of the stuff that Theresa May introduced, like when the hostile environment was being concocted and becoming legislation, when it was becoming legislated, you know, involved like asking these really invasive questions around in public life, like having to prove your sexuality, like having to through like, you know, use of photographs, talking about your sex life, you know, all this private stuff that nobody should have to disclose, yet alone to the Home Office, right? So it's like, okay, so there are these moments where in trying to challenge the bureaucracy, we can understand where we meet different forms of harm, like very different forms of harm, but actually we all have a shared interest in, say, getting rid of this relentless document checks. And this is also to remember that the climate of checking documents in this way is recent. Like 20 years ago, there was a public conversation around having identity cards, and it was ludicrous. Like, as in, like, the idea of having an identity card that somebody from the state, somebody from the police would check was considered ludicrous. And 20 years later, we have the hostile environment policy, where it's like, anywhere you go, there's anyone you work for has the right to check for your passport and report you if you have unclear work, like permission to work, if you don't have proof of right to work in the UK. So this is one of these examples of, like, how can we think through these hinges of, like, where our struggles meet and intersect. And I know it's not the most, like, uplifting, like, example, but it is, like, a really important one. Yeah. Because, like, yeah, I feel like if we're pushing against this, if we're pushing against the hostile environment as much as there's a impetus to try and get GRA reform in the really limited terms that, you know, like, I'm going to try and not go off about the history of GRA reform, but, like, there was a whole, even the Scottish government's consultation process was a massive time waste. They consulted us twice. They first announced 2 days before Edinburgh Pride that they weren't going to do GRA reform. Everyone was hella upset. Like, we were like, why do we have to spend all this time talking to the government when we also don't want the government to have this information on us? And then, like, what did we get? We got this watered down version that didn't even happen in those constitutional crises. Like, amazing. Thanks. Amazing. Anyway.
Yeah.
So I think, like, one of the things that I always think about with in terms of intersectionality is this is actually something that I very often use in my capacity as a union representative. Very often, when workers in the workplace are dealing with transphobic abuse, we use what's called a 1-2 punch technique. The Equality Act 2010 is pretty much the strongest piece of legislation that union reps usually use, because unlike, along with health and safety, because unlike most employment law, it kicks in before 2 years. After 2 years, you're covered by employment law. Before then, it's literally just the company's made up rules, which don't actually matter. So essentially, like, what we'll do is we use the 1-2 punch. And now what that is very often when transphobic abuse is dealt with, is done, it will be on 2 counts. It will be on the count of gender reassignment, which is, I say that I have changed my sex legally under the Equality Act, and it will be on the case of sex, which counterintuitively does not actually mean sex, it means gender. So we'll usually use these 2 as, like, a way to say, right, this is why you know, these are the 2 counts that you're in violation of. But simultaneously, we'll also try and use a similar technique if it's a cis woman, where we'll try, you know, we'll find other ways in which these intersections, like, make any kind of abuse in the workplace particularly bad. But the fact of the matter is, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in society, the people that are actually usually in power and doing the oppression are the same people. Is more or less, it's the owning class. So if we're going to build power to bring about trans liberation, that power could also be used to bring around to bring about liberation of other people. So why not combine those forces? And if anything, that makes us even more powerful. But yeah, like, to Gina's point, I did want to say, like, I think we can think a lot about, like, all the complexities of class and these kind of these stereotypes of, like, oh, here's what kind of people are like. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you ask me, there's only 2 classes, and that is the folks who work for a living and make money by working, and the folks who own things for a living and make money by owning things. And I think, to me, that's the big difference. But yeah.
Brilliant. I really like, how concrete a lot of those examples are, and they go some way to sort of feeding into that next question, which is, what can we do right now to advance trans liberation? and that finding these little hinges, as you call them, Nat, where two different fights meet and we fight together, we find a solution for both, I think is a really interesting starting point for a lot of things, and a really exciting place that I think has been cropping up more and more out of necessity, that place where refugee rights or migrant rights are meeting LGBT rights. Just being one, it was heartening to see so many recognizable faces from the queer community at the Palestine solidarity rally on Saturday. That, again, it's, when we say people are being bombed in Gaza, queer people are being bombed in Gaza. This idea that you can separate people along these lines is ludicrous, but it's also done deliberately by people who hold that power. So I wonder if I can ask now for just maybe a brief example, if you were going to throw in, and I'm saying brief so that I can bounce it out to you next, so thinking caps on, for any questions that you had or contributions that you want to make in response to any of these questions. Something concrete right now that could be done for trans liberation, or that you've been involved in, or that you've seen be effective in terms of fighting for trans liberation right now, today, where we are in Edinburgh. Does anyone want to? Yeah, go for it.
Thanks very much. I'll be quick. Well, I think it was mentioned, I'm a member of the Unite Scotland LGBT Plus Committee. No merit of my own, it was just there was gaps, so they thought I'd do. And that means I get to go to these conferences, like the STUC LGBT Plus conference, and it's amazing in one way that we pass all these wonderful revolutions, I wish, resolutions about all sorts of great stuff, and it's wonderful. They get passed unanimously, and then silence. And they get kind of stuck. The bureaucracy will be kind of doing what they do, and your average member, average union member, probably doesn't even know it's happened. So what happened to me recently was my husband Graham is a member of the Unite Retired Lothians branch, and he asked the branch if they'd be interested in getting somebody for the Unite Scotland LGBT Plus Committee, and unfortunately for them they got me. But I just spoke for about a minute about what the committee did, and after that I said, just please cross-examine me. And they cross-examined me wonderfully, and there was one member, a lady member, said that they were worried about an 8-year-old person deciding they were trans, and they could just get all these drugs and that, hormones and that, and they might decide when they were about 13 that they'd made a mistake. So I just basically explained very quickly that there was about a 3 to 4 year waiting list for your first appointment at a gender identity clinic, and even if that went fine, you were going to have to wait longer for assessments. And in the end of the day, it was down to your GP if you actually got puberty blockers, which are, by the way, totally reversible, no problems at all. And the member was kind enough to say that they thought that had answered the concerns they had. And I think it would be really good if people are in a trade union, if they could maybe try and get somebody from the United LGBT Plus Committee, hopefully somebody better than me, to come along and speak to a branch meeting. Because again, it's an opportunity for them to meet a queer person. We've got a lot of trans people on the committee, trans and non-binary people on the committee. And it might be the case that it's the first time they've actually met one of us. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a long answer, so bear with me. So I think one of the things that I really want to underline is liberation is about practices, right? It's about what we do in our lives. So it's a question about, like, where do we make liberation in our lives? Where are our struggles located, right? When we're talking about rights, when we're talking about even workplace issues, we're talking about these institutional contexts, right? If we're talking about we're angry at the state, we're pissed off with the gender clinic, these are all forms of institutions. So that's like one place of struggle that's maybe the most obvious, the most visible, say, the bit that has the most collateral in terms of the media, and where all these, the ones that we can kind of like concretely grab and hold of and think about. And so that's one space of like where we're trying to liberate ourselves from, maybe. But then next to that is like, okay, there's these political elements in our everyday lives, like these forms of oppression that we experience, like be that everyday, like transphobia in our everyday lives, et cetera, and how we understand those things politically. And then there's also like this general social level of like who's in our community, who's in the room with us today, like who's in our everyday lives. And because like these, like, if you know, these cultural forces of oppression, be it racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, Satanism, xenophobia, like these are all forms of division. And you were talking about the separation and this like practice of trying to separate us, right? And like divide and rules, like the oldest colonial tactic in the book, right? Like how do you other people? How do you say dehumanize people? And so there's like, okay, so how do we challenge that dynamic of separation in our everyday lives, in our social lives, in how we understand our lives politically, and then also in these institutional contexts where some of us, this might be about where we work, this might be about where we pray, it might be about where we grow up. Like, these are all these different forms of where these separations happen, and because ultimately, like, we have to break down all of this separation, it's like, I'm thinking a lot about, obviously this week, thinking about what I've been learning from my queer Palestinian friends and like my queer and non-binary and trans Palestinian friends, because they're the people I have the deepest conversations about political grief with. And part of that is because, like, my experiences of organizing in Edinburgh is like, Edinburgh's been really bad dealing with racism in the queer and trans communities in our organizing spaces. And it's eaten through a lot of really important organizations that have been here. And part of that is like, okay, so how do we challenge that separation? How do we challenge these forms of otherness that when racism gets raised as a problem that's emerging, or it's clear that like there's a lack of action on racism, and this is like even after everything with BLM in 2020, even after George Floyd's death, even after everyone had we had all of our book groups to learn about anti-racism if it was a new thing to us, we're still failing on racism. So, which is a really basic form of separation in our lives, in our everyday lives. So I really want to say, like, these are things that we can try and make and undo, these divisions, and that there are really simple practices also that can be really empowering. Like, we haven't spoken so much about mutual aid, but like there've been loads of really great mutual aid products in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in the UK. Not just about redistributing money, but also doing practical redistribution of things, like be that gender, like we were doing lots of stuff with Action for Trans Health around gender affirming kit, like make it like having clothes swaps, like providing binders and like, and like false, what's the word? What do I want to say? Like providing kit that made your body feel a bit better about yourself, doing laser hair removal for each other, this kind of stuff. And it's like all of these really practical things in the everyday are ways that we can build liberation for ourselves. Because if we're trying to get rid of these forms of oppression, we're trying to shift the weight of survival into one of thrivance, right? Of thriving, of feeling joy. And if we can uproot those forms of violence and it's like in our bodies, right? This is like, when I think about what gender affirmation has given me, it's like, oh, it's given me literally more breathing space, more thinking space, more being space. And all of that is embodied. It's not just mental. And yeah, and so it's like, okay, so how do we do that? And maybe like love and like care and these everyday practices of like, who is in our lives, who we support, who we prioritize, their ways of cutting down this separability. And I'm not really sure, and it's like, there's no one size fits all. It's all like, whatever we can do, you can do what you can try and do. Oh, sorry, what do I want to say? Do what you can try and do. But there's like a dozen ways, and some of them will be better than others. But there's not necessarily wrong ways. You just got to keep trying things. So yeah, so that's my long answer.
So for myself, like, and this one's a personal one to me. Like, I'm sure one or two of you has probably been in a group chat with a politics chat, and the internet is kind of a siren in that it pretends, you look through this box and you're looking at it and it pretends it's the whole world, but it's not actually the whole world. It's a wee bit of the world. It's not even that. It's a tiny bit of the world. But then it seems like it's everything. And the only thing that you can do is interact with it on its terms in a wee tweet or in an email or what have you. You can interact with it on its terms. But it's constantly, like, people on there are constantly telling you, if you didn't care about this, you're a bad activist. Or they're telling you, like, you have to care about 20 things a second, or they're commiserating with you, and you get into this cycle where you'll find all this bad news, and then you'll share it with your mates because commiserating with it is cathartic. And then after you've shared it with your mates, well, that felt good, so you go back to the thing again. And what happens with that is it builds up and builds up and builds up until either you burn out and stop caring, or you do something really stupid. And this is the radicalization pipeline that things like the alt-right use. That's why so many of them do school shootings. But it happens to us and all. And one of the biggest things that helped me get out of that is doing stuff in person, like whether that's music and food and song, or whether that is like building community. But I mean, obviously, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, didn't just join the union, start organising one, because when you see something small where you are, whether that's in your workplace, whether that's in your community, whether that's on your street, well, when you're on the internet, there's nothing you can do because you're one person among billions. But then when you're in the real world, all of a sudden, if you start doing a food stall every day or every week, or say if you go down to a pub and have a conversation with one person every day, or, well, you can see that change. And if you get 10 people, well, you can basically do anything you want. You can have the local council like in your fucking pocket, if you pardon my language. It was actually absurd to me how much power I realized that I had in my local community when I actually started looking for ways to stick my nose in other people's business. And that's what I think is one, organize your workplace. Two, just try and do small things local with your mates, because you will find you actually have a lot more power than you thought you did.
Okay, the very short answer following Tilly is, yeah, get off Twitter. Yeah, and I'm a hypocrite, but I definitely, no, I do, God bless Elon Musk. He's made Twitter almost unusable. I almost don't go on it. I mean, maybe sometimes once a day, but it used to be like 5 times a day. Join the union. Okay, so I joined UCU, and I just, for the crack, and just thinking, oh, yes, the pink hats. But really interesting with the unions, because I'd grown up, in Thatcher's Britain, and the narrative is unions were rubbish. They destroyed Britain. Thank God for Thatcher. And that was the Blairite. That's the Labour narrative as well. But when you've actually been involved in the union, and I thought, okay, nothing's going to happen because Edinburgh University, it's entrenched, all these things, it's part of the neoliberal progress narrative, not regressive narrative. But there was a breakthrough. I think it was 2 weeks ago. The union won in terms of the pensions are being cut, and now those cuts have been removed. And it's like, wow. Exactly, it was all me. No, it wasn't. But I joined, and I picketed, and I did little bits. I mean, one person on a picket line. But if 50 people decide to do that, suddenly you've got 50 people on a picket line. Being part of a mass movement and realizing you can be successful. We've been brought up by the media and the narrative of the two main parties to believe that these things don't work, but they do. So it's about realizing, people like Mick Lynch now are like superstars because people are realizing these are straight talking people who know their stuff. They recognize the inequality in Britain, and they're not prepared to put up with it, and people kind of like that. So it is about being inspired and joining unions and interacting with people from all over, fighting for each other's rights, and it's a wonderful feeling. So get off Twitter, join unions.
Okay, I'm going to come out to you with a mic. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Want to get the ball rolling with this? Yeah, there we go.
I was waiting to see if other trans folk wanted to put their hands up first, because I'm really here to listen to trans voices, but just seeing as nobody jumped in, and I've got a big mouth. I kind of accidentally hijacked Jane Godley's recent toilet door drama on Twitter. I don't know if anyone saw it. I'm a bit of a troll hunter on Twitter. I think it's a byproduct of having a toxic childhood that actually, in times of great crisis and war, I'm extremely comfortable, and I think it's playtime. So I've been hosting like 24-hour dance parties with Scottish music and talking to people in Ukraine about the Rosillos and people all over, talking about my local chippy quite a lot. And it seems to work if people just keep talking to each other. And one of the conversations I had with Telia that seems to have changed where I was going is I was going to go to a demo because I knew that the intersection organising had come between the gender critical feminists and fascists, and I've been an anti-fascist ever since I was a teenager. And I had the strange experience of being doxxed as a trans woman, despite the fact that I'm cis and I'm a mother. So I said very little. I just kind of let it happen, and I had a really funny interview with the police when they had all this and intel on me about how many children I'd fathered and abandoned and what kind of sexual deviant I was. And I was talking about how my kid needed piano lessons, but his dad was being a bit of a twat about him coming for his dinner late and things like that. So we had this really odd hour-long conversation that I ended up lecturing them about fascists and techno-fascists and how they use Twitter and things like that. And the trolls are toxic troll energy, you're right, do not engage. But you can engage with them and not engage emotionally. So I'm not quite sure, but I think what I've done is I've volunteered to sort of kickstart an organisation based on Mums for Trans in Ireland, where it's mums that go along, and if you need somebody on the front line to take the grief, because they're all they're conspiracy theorists and they're down rabbit holes and they believe all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons. But what they believed about me was that because I was there standing next to my trans brothers and sisters opposing fascism, that meant that I was born a man. And they can believe that if they want. Good luck to them. But I'm looking to recruit, I'm not a leader, but I'm looking to recruit mums, young mums, old mums, grandmums, any mums. If you've got a mum, if you want a mum, if you live next door to a mum or down the street from a mum, please put them in touch with me. I'm Linda Perry on Twitter. You can have a look at my Twitter. I eat trolls for breakfast. I'm like an elf with Doc Martens. I really do. I really do rip people some new arseholes some days. And so I jumped on Jane Godley getting trolled, and I says, right, let's do it. And I tagged Mums for Trans, and they were up for it. I've got a woman in Stirling, has a professional career. So this is it. It's going to be locally organised, but if anybody knows any mums or knows anything that we should be doing, tell us, And Leslie, cakes, yes. Pies. Sustenance is our strength.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I've got a wee rule. I always bring sausage rolls on the pickets.
Did anyone else have a hand in the there? Oh, yeah, there you go. I'll hand it to you, and then if you want to hand it down.
Hi. So I wanted to return to what Ned and what everyone has mentioned, that trans liberation in large part is liberation from parents. And thank you for Moms for Trans initiative. But I think it's like for young trans people across the world, parents are the single group of people that has the most power of them, that poses the most existential crisis of them. I mean, people are like tortured, institutionalized by their parents, and because we have this ideology, this parental ideology where parents have the absolute right to dominate, to determine, like, to dominate the bodies of their children, of young people. I mean that applies like to different degrees in around the world, but it's a thing that holds around the world. I come from China, and so yeah, I would say every single trans person in China under the age of 25 are that would be like millions of people are like under the single thing that they worry about is their parents deciding one day to just send them off to one of the internet addiction treatment centers, because that's one thing the parents can do, you know, no matter what, if you're adult or not. Yeah, like I mean, these are places not just for trans people. I mean, they're also like non-trans people, and they also send people there for like just being, just playing games too much. But yeah, like I think so much of trans liberation is, I mean, how would you go about solving it? How would you go about like removing that fear of being institutionalized, tortured, abused? You know, awful stuff happen in these places. They're literally prisons. They hire ex-veterans to beat people up. Worse stuff. Like, how do you remove that fear? Well, it's by making it so that parents no longer have that power over young people. For not just in particular for trans people, like, but like they have no right to torture people for whatever reason. It's like to me, trans liberation is liberation of young people. It's the liberation of children from parents. I think that is like, yeah, just from a Chinese trans perspective, I think that is the single most important thing. Because sometimes like cis allies who really do a lot for trans people and speak on behalf of trans people every day, and I mean, oftentimes they a lot of the work they do is fight against the TERF narrative, gender critical narrative, and in the like feminist discourse, and that is all that work is very important. But the everyday reality of trans people is, yeah, that is like parents. That's the single. Yeah. I'm very scared. So the one thing I'm scared of seeing in the UK is that many of the anti-trans groups, they're adapting this parentist narrative from the film they tried to screen at Edinburgh University, Adult Human Female. One of the introductory sentences was, "Oh, is it really harmless when doctors mutilate our children?" Like that narrative. A few weeks ago in Toronto, in Canada, there was this anti-trans march, and within that anti-trans, there's a larger pro-trans counter-march, but within that anti-trans crowd, a young person held up a placard saying, "I belong to my parents." That is, I would imagine, that person's parents asserting their, like, you know, they're making their children say proudly, "I belong to my parents." I think that is really the thing that, I mean, if the effect of that is like, when you have state backing for parents' power, you get what happens in China. Yeah, because it's not that the government is oppressing us. I mean, these are like private institutions. They are semi-illegal, but no one cracks down on them because parents have the right to do what they want to children. So.
I'll go and then I'll pass to that. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that, like, you know, my relationship with my mum improved significantly as soon as I had moved out and no longer lived with her, you know. But like, I do think that, like, you know, the emancipation of young folks is a seriously important thing for us to fight for, and we're seeing some of that in Edinburgh. Like, I'm aware of, like, there's a recently started high school students union that have been they're very coordinated, but they've been organizing right now in the high schools for computers. And they're specifically, basically, they've been given these computers, but they're basically completely useless because the company doesn't want to be doesn't want to be sued if they look up anything bad. But so they've been organising around that, and I do think that like stuff like that and young folks getting together is really important. But I also think that as adults, we have a responsibility to have a pedagogy that's less based on domination and recreating the domination of society, to kind of paraphrase Frere, and more based on learning alongside the bairns and actually treating them with dignity as human beings. And I think that's the main thing, is just I feel like, you know, you see the way that, like, you know, your boss dominates you and you think that's the way that I should act towards my bairn, but actually then, you know, it's not right if a boss does it to you, and a bairn's just as much a person as you are. They're just a bit stupider. You know? No, but I shouldn't say that.
As a boss, a patriarchal father, you know, all these things. Thank you for sharing, actually. I think there's something you described about the fear of being sent away to to the internet re-education. Maybe there's a question about resilience, which is, well, not a question. There's, you know, I really want to remember that, like, we're really resilient. Like, trans people and non-binary people have survived. We've survived some shit, you know. And I'm not going to try and talk super personally because it's a bit weird for me to talk super personally. But I mean, I was out as a trans teenager. One of the things that really gets me at the moment is a total lack of trans kids' voices in the whole conversation, at least in the UK, around trans youth, which I think already demonstrates that they don't value the knowledge that trans youth have of themselves. You know, that it's like, oh no, your voices don't matter. What you want, your feelings don't matter. What you want doesn't matter. Because, and I mean, obviously that's media as well, and that's like how the media functions through othering, is silencing. It's very easy to silence minors. But I also want to just like think about like some of the things that I've really taken strength from recently, and like, I mean, definitely the past couple of years in particular, is the, maybe it's kind of like the reverse pedagogy. It's the, I think about parents who've learned loads from their trans kids, including sometimes gaining the strength to come out as trans, you know? And it's not that we, the adults, are transing the kids. It's that, okay, there's all this dispersed access to information, like trans people were more present in popular culture. And actually, yeah, like, you know, I say this, like, I learn from my students in the same way that you hope good parents learn from their kids. You know, that's, I think any of us who are grown up and have our parents, you know, we're still hopefully teaching our parents stuff. That's part of our role. And yeah, I think just having that space and being like, and then thinking, I also think about my friends who are like trans folks who are parents, and they also have trans kids. And again, just like this process of learning. And there's so much power in that. I also want to be like, but you can also divorce your parents, right? Like, that's a legal thing you can do, at least in the UK. It's obviously really troubled if you're a minor as well. But like, you know, sometimes the harm doesn't end even when you're an adult. So, oh yeah, and also I was going to say the trans section 28 thing. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I was trying to remember what it's called. Section 35, around this, like, trying to restrict any kind of trans affirmative practice in schools, which could also really backfire on trans affirmative parents as well. Just, yeah.
I have, it's like kind of a very practical question, in that in the very small world that is like student organizing, a lot of folks have noticed that at Edinburgh University, campus security have gotten a lot more aggressive recently, about being physically aggressive towards students, and also calling the cops on student protesters and student organizers. Like recently, there was a protest today where a student that was protesting for Palestinian liberation got taken in. So I guess what do we do in the face of mounting violence from both like the institution that we're technically like part of, and also like them like weaponizing the state against us. And also, I have so many questions. I'm sorry. I have another question, which is there's like a lot of talk about educating others and bringing others in to create like, you know, broader liberation movements. But what do you do when you're emotionally burnt out from educating people, when opening up about your experiences to folks that might be hostile is really too taxing, too draining? Like, I don't know, like, yeah, what do you do when you just get burnt out? I don't know.
So, I can definitely address the, I think, what do you do when you're burnt out? I think a lot of it for me is, I've definitely been in that position where you're like, oh, I don't want to explain things and have the trans conversation. It's a reality that like we kind of have to have it a lot. I'll confess, I try not to think in terms of burnout. I try and think in terms of, you know, can I be bothered? And in terms of like, what, you know, I think it really helps to have a supportive group of folks around you and, you know, have that support and have like folks that you can turn to, because I think it is unfortunately a reality that like we do kind of have to have a lot of those conversations, and it's a learning experience. As you have those conversations more and more, while it will be exhausting, there is, I do feel that you get better at it, and you get better at it. Myself, I got the autism, so you'll probably notice if you're talking to me that I do probably say a lot of the things that I'm saying here just in a conversation, because I'm like a robot. But like, what I do find is like, if you're having a conversation with somebody and somebody brings it up, like it really does help just to, you know, you can say the very basics and then just kind of bluster past. But I find actually asking them questions about themselves or getting to know them helps actually quite a lot, because I find for myself at least, a lot of the tiringness of having the trans conversation is the fact I've said it so many times it's boring. And that's why I find it tiring. And I find when you actually get to know the person who's asking you the questions, and like, I think of it as a little bit of a game. Oh, you're going to ask a question. I don't know exactly which one. Well, I'm going to ask you a question first. That said, if someone's being really annoying about it, like is nothing wrong with saying like, oh, can we talk about this later or whatever. And I do think that like doing it on your own terms is also a thing that'll help, you know. But I think when I hear the word burnout, what I usually think is a systemic failure of a support structure. Because burnout, I think, for myself, there's two kinds of burnout. There's, I don't have the energy because people aren't supporting me enough, and that means you need to build a support network, or I can't be bothered, and that's fine. I think it's fine to not be bothered sometimes. I think it's good to not be bothered sometimes, because that means you can save your energy for things you actually want to do, you know?
Aye, thank you very much. I think really good questions. I mean, and following on from what Tilly said, I mean, this is a bit of a shameless ad for Resisting Transphobia in Edinburgh. But what I like about the organisation is that we've got so many amazing people with so many different skills and talents and abilities, so many creative people. But it's turning out to be that if somebody does need a bit of time out, they can take a bit of time out, knowing that the organisation is still there, they've still got support if they need it, but there's no pressure to do more than you feel you want to do. And I agree, I think it's something that's good to you feel you can't be bothered. The thing about the protests, I mean, yeah, absolute solidarity. I wish I could have been along this afternoon. I just couldn't be. I was up to the eyes with stuff. But I think the thing is that the only way to protect ourselves and protect the right to protest is basically strength of numbers. I think amazing. I mean, I know a number of folk here came out when that person got arrested, and they got de-arrested, unarrested. And that only happened because there were loads and loads and loads of folks surrounding those 7 police vans and going to the police station. Brilliant. And I think, unfortunately, we can't rely on appealing to the university authorities or any authorities, but we just have to do it. Strength in numbers. It's like the anti-raids thing. I mean, basically, if we, the Home Office tries to do something nasty, hostile environment, it's only through getting the numbers out there, Kenmure Street in Glasgow, Nicholson Square in Edinburgh, that you can actually stop it. We've stopped them before, we'll stop them again.
Leslie just said most of what I'm going to say. So I was just going to add, like, sharing the knowledge and the information about what's happening, because it's something about like spreading this understanding of the reality that you're facing, especially if it's like increased policing, increased security. We know that like who gets affected when there's increased security around campus. It's like POC, it's like women, it's like feminized people, queers, trans folks, obviously in there. And it makes me think about like there's loads of ways of being like, oh, this is it's a waste of money. Like the university I did my postgraduate study at, there was loads of political organizing. There was a really long occupation for like 3 or 4 months. The university spent like $500,000 on security during that time, which was the same time they were cutting 235 jobs. So it was like, okay, this is messed up. But sharing information, and also not just on the internet, unless you're going to hack the algorithms, but making sure everybody knows, right? Because I think that's the strength with Kenmure Street 3. It's like, it's part of the political history of Scotland now, because this thing happened, and we know that strength in numbers works.
We had we are technically out of time, and there was one online question which I would just want to give an opportunity if anyone has sort of a brief response, and then I'm going to hand over to Kit, which was around the connected struggles of disability and trans rights, and if anyone wanted to put a wee word out on that. Yeah. Right. I'll run that past Kid. Yeah. But yeah, so disability and trans rights, where those overlap.
Yes, I think that's a really important question. I mean, I have to say, I have only to my shame got a bit educated about disabled peoples and, the situation they're in. It's through a person I know, particularly somebody I know through COVID Action Scotland, Dr. Sally Whitcher. And she describes herself as disabled, and she told me about what is called the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And the medical model of disability is basically like, well, you've got a problem, you've got this, well, we can maybe help you a bit, but, you've got a problem, it's a medical issue, and, basically we might try our best to help you, but it's your problem as an individual. And that's the medical model, crudely speaking. The social model is basically that society is structured under capitalism to make people disabled. There's absolutely no reason why anybody, whether they can see or not see, hear or not hear, have the use of all their limbs or not have all the use of their limbs, if we actually organised things properly and made everything genuinely accessible to people, nobody would be disabled. And I think a good example of that is this. You might have seen the basically it's the Tories. They want to force rail operators to close down ticket offices. That's obviously a big issue, not just for people that have mobility issues or whatever, or sensory issues, but somebody like me that's useless with technology. I have to get help to switch the microphone off, for goodness sake. Am I going to be able to operate a ticket office, a ticket machine? No, I am not. I am not. So that's a small example of how a society makes people disabled, excludes people for totally stupid reasons, absolutely to do with capitalism, wanting to save money. That's it. So it's capitalism that makes people disabled, and there's no reason for it.
Thank you.
I'm going to add really quickly and just say that there's so many practices that come from disability justice organising that we've all taken for granted, especially during the pandemic, like the whole kind of strategy of mutual aid and collective care that we all are developing in our lives. That's all because of disability justice, and like I'm really grateful that like my friends who are disabled are the people who I've learned those kind of skills from. But I also want to say that within the trans community, we have real power if we actually have deeper conversations about the nuance of the intersection between trans and disability, and particularly around chronic illness. I think some of the most interesting work that has been some of the most interesting stuff that's been happening is trying to think through the intersections of that around our healthcare. And I just want to encourage people to try and have more of those conversations, like gather your friends, be like, hey, like, you know, check in around what's going on with your health, especially if you're experiencing chronic pain, because there's really interesting stuff going on, and there's not enough research about it, right? So we often know more than the research. So that's just like thing to do.
Brilliant, thank you, Nat. I'm going to read one final statement which was sent in by Sigrid Nilsson, who runs the Lavender Menace archive. And then I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's got some last bits and pieces. So she writes, I believe in crossing the line, not just once, but as many times as it takes to build a bridge that we can all walk across. Del Legre's Volcano, who is intersex and lives both as a man and a woman, made that statement in 2005 about her work as a photographer. I'm a 75-year-old feminist, and I believe that what Del Legre's said about their art also applies to the feminist movement. I'm very glad this meeting is being held tonight, and I'm sorry I couldn't be here. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about feminism as a liberation movement, an enabler of women and of all people who are defined as other and unequal by the patriarchy. In the media and on the internet these days, you're likely to hear about a kind of feminism whose goal is to build a fortress around people with XX chromosomes. But the feminist movement I joined in 1970, whatever joined means, because I can assure you I didn't fill in a form, couldn't have been more different. One of my heroes was Shulamith Firestone, who wrote a book called The Dialectic of Sex. It was based on Marxist theory and featured an almost science-fictional picture of liberation of the world. They thought big in those days. Firestone believed that what we call the binary today will be overcome by technological change, but only if society makes the right choices. Feminists have to question the organization of culture itself, even the very organization of nature, she said. That questioning is still ongoing. Living as our authentic selves is creative resistance. Feminism and queer joy are bridges, and we'll keep walking. So with that, can I...
Hi folks, some of you will know me, but many won't. My name is Kit, and I'm one of the people that's been putting this together. It's been a great team. I wanted to just, for starters, say a quick word. Like, tonight has been really heartening. Speaking for myself, I've learned a lot. I've been inspired, and I've also been reassured. And I've been reassured that the route to trans liberation is not through some great work. You know, the revolution would be welcome, but while we're waiting for it, it's the small things. It's our day-to-day interactions. It's the relationships that we're building with one another that are making a real difference here. And we've heard examples of that, and we've been given examples of things that we can do. I want to just take a moment with you all to extend sincere thanks to all of the speakers tonight. Leslie and Nat, Tilly and Gina. And thanks also to Mari and Lighthouse for being wonderful and supporting us as ever, hosting this and doing all the complicated internet bits that we're not always great at. I've seen a real interest in sharing one another's experiences and concerns as well in the discussions that we've had this evening. We're about to put the mics away, but that's really not the end of the conversation. It's sort of the beginning. We need to keep on talking to one another, and we need to keep on building those human connections. So we have run a bit over time. We were hoping to sort of finish up the official chat by 9, but we have the room for a bit longer. So I invite you to have conversations with one another. I invite you to go and check out the stalls if you have a moment. I very much encourage you, if you haven't already, to join the Resisting Transphobia in Edinburgh mailing list. There is a paper sign-up pad at the back, and I'll also do a little spreadsheet one at the front to make that easier. And if you've been inspired and if you want to carry on with this work, I invite you to come along to our next organising meeting, which will be on Monday, the 13th of November. which is rather exciting. For one, it'll be our second ever full big in-person meeting, and it'll be here at Augustine's, so you can't say you don't know the way. And also, there's going to be an organisation called Flint present, and I'd like to invite Ames to come up very briefly and explain what that's all about, because, sorry? Just briefly.
2 minutes. Yeah, super quickly. I'm part of an organisation called Flint, which is trying to imagine and build a national trans organisation which is revolutionary, which is abolitionist, which is joining the fight against colonialism, against racial capitalism in the UK and across the world. We're doing stuff in Edinburgh with RT. We're also based in London, and we're doing sort of an assembly in Manchester as well later in the year. Our work is, very briefly, it's got like 4 points to it. It's coalitional, so we're working with trade unions. We'll be at the Queer Bloc at the Palestine March in London tomorrow. My history is in sort of border abolitionist work and search and rescue, and we're very much working towards looking at how border abolition is part and essential to trans liberation, as well as is sort of all abolitionist work. We're also looking at like models of radical education and member defense. So whether that's like making sure that everyone knows how to be a medical advocate in a very violent medical system, but also how we can protect each other from landlords and evictions, or like today, I just came for a little wander around Edinburgh and suddenly I was outside a police van chanting, like, let him out. Didn't know who he was, but I was like, he's coming out of there. But part of that is also the work we're doing, right? Like, how do we protect each other? How do we fight for each other? How do we see a police van with someone going into it and know that person is my comrade, that person is my sibling? I'm not letting that van go away. And how do we as trans people know our rights in those situations as well, especially against cops, landlords, immigration enforcement, who are not only sort of violent in many ways, but also specifically will be violent towards trans and gender non-conforming people. But also, I think most crucially, we're trying to be an imaginative space as well. Like, none of us have the answers, but also a lot of us are spending our time, like I think someone on the panel said, surviving. And a lot of what we're trying to do is create imaginative spaces too. Like, we're not just burning stuff down, we're not just stopping police vans, but also thinking, what do we build up in that space as well, which is a very abolitionist call to, I guess, like burn it down and then radically imagine different spaces of like care, love, and joy, where those institutions of violence are gonna disappear, and we're gonna create something in their space. Yeah, so we're gonna be at the meeting in November. We're gonna be having an assembly in London on the 9th of December, and I think an assembly in Manchester on the 6th of December. If you want to like come chat to me in this room, maybe for a pint afterwards as well, I really need one. That would be sick. Yeah, come and let me know.
Brilliant. Yeah, I suppose just one last thanks for our wonderful speakers. This has been an amazing night, and I'll let you go into the night. Thanks so much for coming, folks.